When I moved to Beaumont, Texas, in the fall of 2003, Pat Riley was the youngest of the 6 men who were serving that church family as elders at that time. In fact, if my memory is correct, Pat had only been appointed as an elder about 6 months before they had started talking to me. So he was a rookie elder. I have to confess that the first 6 months I was there, getting to know this church family and getting to know this leadership team, I had a very difficult time figuring out Pat. Because I'd worked with a lot of elders over the years, and Pat just wasn't like any elder I had ever encountered before. First of all, he was just young. He looked young, not like I thought an elder ought to look. And our guys would meet on Wednesdays for an hour before services. And when Pat would come in for the meeting, he'd have his golf shirt on, his blue jean, his white millennial tennis shoes, and he would plop down on the floor in a corner of the room. And that's where he would hold court during these elders meetings. In fact, he called himself the sergeant at arms in the elders meeting. The other guys would surely want y'all to know that there was no such position in the eldership. It was one that Pat had created and a title he had given to himself, and not the only title he gave himself. And basically what it meant was that if he ever felt like one of the guys was kind of rambling on about something and getting off the subject and frankly just kind of holding up things, he reserved the right to call the guy out and put it into that and get this thing on track and get a decision made. And if you're sitting there thinking, that sounds like that could be really awkward. Yeah, it was. But Pat was one of these people, and you know somebody like this, who could say anything, just the plainest things to anybody, and then he would flash that dumb, cheesy grin of his, and somehow everything would be okay after that. He and I lived pretty close together in the same little bedroom community of Beaumont, and so when there would be events that the leadership team was getting together, having a meeting or something, he and I often rode together, talked together about God and his work, and over time we got to be really good friends. And so I'd been there a couple of years. Pat was getting close to 50, and he went in for some tests that men have as they get close to 50. Did I say enough about that? Did you follow? And I don't have to go further, right? Routine kind of stuff. But the results weren't routine. And so there were more tests, and they were bad. And then there was a procedure. And, basically after weeks of the doctors getting all of their work done, they confronted Pat with the grim reality that he had a very aggressive metastatic cancer. And the doctors in Beaumont said, we think you have about 6 months. And they sent him home to die. I mean, he wasn't even 50 yet. And he wasn't satisfied with that diagnosis, so y'all know where he went, right? Yeah, MD Anderson. And the doctors over here in Houston were far more optimistic. They felt like that there were some treatments available at MD Anderson, that they could slow down the growth of this cancer maybe for a season. They could stop it. And of course, there's always the who knows what may be coming on the horizon in the way of cures. And so they felt like they could help him. But essentially, the diagnosis didn't change. He wasn't going to win this battle. And Pat was faced with the reality that he was going to die. I was in the meeting when he called the leadership team together and shared his diagnosis. And I was sitting in that meeting when he had a pretty straight talk with his fellow shepherds. And this is what he said. I vividly remember this. He said, we are withdrawing from people in this church that I'm supposed to be shepherding. And he said, I don't even know who some of these people are. And he said, now that I know my time is coming to meet the chief shepherd and to give an account, either we're going to have to agree to change the way we do business around here, or I will need to resign as an elder so I can be ready to meet the Lord. And so, there was an interesting discussion that took place in that room that night, but basically the way it came out was that this group of leaders decided they would change the way they did business. And Pat was the trailblazer on that. He went back to God's book and tried to look at what God said the work of a shepherd of God's people really is, and recognized that more and more that was about people and not about business and bookkeeping. And he read some other books about all of that, and then he would come to our leadership meetings and he would do presentations and kind of help lead the way in understanding that. But it wasn't all just discussions with the group about theory. He began to try to put that in practice and be an example to others. And so he's trying to spend time with his sheep, interact with his sheep, get to know them. He's going to ball games, have people over to his house, all the while trying to battle cancer. He developed a really close relationship with our college students. He was asked to teach one quarter, and after he taught that quarter, he never left the college class again until he couldn't attend anymore. In fact, even if he wasn't the teacher, he was sitting in the corner in this classroom. In fact, the college kids gave him a title, which he loved. They called him the scholar in the corner. And I don't have any idea why they called him that. He was not scholarly, not in any way. Those of us who taught while he was sitting in the class had a different title for him. We called him the tormentor in the corner. Because what Pat would do is he would keep an eye on his little sheep in that class and those of us who were teaching. And if he ever felt like we had passed over a question too quickly or didn't deal enough with a hard place in the text, he would put a stop to that. He would say, wait, David, you've got to go back and you've got to deal with that question, or you've got to address this verse because it's really the hard one in the chapter. We just loved having Pat in class to help us like that. The years that intervened his diagnosis, I prayed a lot for Pat. All of us did. I reminded God of a bunch of stuff that he already knew. Pat was making a difference. He wasn't just changing our leadership team. He was changing our church family. And frankly, what he had taken the lead in was beginning to infiltrate other churches and impact their thinking about leadership. He was involved in trying to encourage that stuff. And I prayed Hezekiah's prayer for Pat, that God would extend his life and let him continue to have this impact he was having. Toward the end, it just got really bad. The cancer was in his bones. He was in terrific pain all of the time. I remember one day getting a call that his wife had rushed him to the emergency room. And so I left the office and headed to the hospital. And I'm walking up on this sidewalk that intersects another sidewalk. And on this other sidewalk, it happened that one of his other loved ones, a wayward loved one, was also coming to the hospital at the same time. And so when they intersected, we met up. And when we met up, I got an earful. This loved one of Pat's started into me, and what she wanted to know was, why is God doing this to Pat? He is such a good disciple. He does so much good work. He's so faithful to the Lord. Why is God letting him suffer this way? This was our conversation walking up to the hospital. I didn't know what to say to her. I was struggling with the same question. We lost him in May of 2011. Sunday morning, Mother's Day. And I was left to wrestle with my question. why did Pat Riley die? It just seemed like if ever there was a time where God needed to have a Hezekiah moment and intervene and heal or extend life, this was the time, God. This was the person. And he didn't. And I was disappointed, frustrated. Now let me say to you that I know sharing my story probably just conjures up unpleasant stories for you too, right? And if you're sitting there thinking, I don't know, David, I don't think I have a story yet. And you probably haven't hit 30. But it's coming. And everybody's going to have their season, and we're all going to have to wrestle with the same kind of questions. Why does life seem so unfair sometimes? Why do bad things, really, really terrible things happen to really, really good people? My brother-in-law is just an awesome, dedicated servant of God. I just visited him in the hospital over the med center today. He lost both his lungs 5 years ago. Had to have a double lung transplant. What happened to him? It's not fair. Well, the wicked people around you, don't you see wicked people who are just living the good life and prospering? Why is it that way? And if God is what Psalms promises he will be to us, our rock and our refuge and our deliverer, where was he when Pat needed to be delivered? It is, I think, the most compelling argument that unbelievers make against the existence of God. Atheists will ask, is your God a powerful God? Is he a good and loving God? And to those questions we would say, absolutely yes. And then they will follow up with, then why will 1,000 babies die in Zimbabwe today? Die of starvation. If there was a good God in heaven, a loving God in heaven, why doesn't he take care of the dying babies? And it's an argument that works, especially when the suffering is personal. It's not children I don't know in Africa. It's people that I know and love. I had a guy tell me one time, I'd sat down to study the Bible with this guy. And in our very first session, you know a study's going to go well when the guy across the table says, you're never getting anywhere with me. And he said, when I was 16 years old, my mother died. And I just think if there is a God, he knows how much a 16-year-old kid needs his mom. And if God would let my mom die anyway, I don't care if he does exist. I'm not interested in serving that God. I hate him. Yeah, I didn't get very far with him. It's not a compelling argument because it's logically sound. It actually isn't. It's compelling because it is emotional. It tugs at the heartstrings, especially when it's our self. So, I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about the problem of suffering. I am so impressed that you showed up in spite of the fact that this was the announced topic, because you might have thought we were going to be here till midnight trying to cover a subject like this one. And so let me tell you in advance that I'm acknowledging we don't begin to have time to probe this in the depth it deserves. This could be a quarter of classes, okay? So my plan tonight is not to be very deep, but instead to be broad. Because I think before we decide that maybe God isn't good, or maybe God isn't there at all because all this bad stuff is happening in the world, that there are some things that we need to consider. And I'd like to put a bunch of that on the table tonight and ask you to think with me. Some of the factors we need to consider as we try to process suffering in a healthy way. Think of it as putting apps on your phone. All we're going to do is install the apps tonight. And you'll have to go back later when your seasons come and you've got to wrestle with the questions. And you're going to have to open it up, and you're going to have to dig around. All I want to do tonight is give you some places where I think we need to be digging. So I got until a quarter till, right? Okay, very good. That's the end of my time. not optimistic that I will even hit that close, but we'll get through as many of these as we can. Hey, before I do that, can I just tell y'all one personal thing real quick? I don't even know if there's anybody in this crowd tonight who was here in 1985. You were? We know each other. The Bellaire Church, I've had kind of occasional interactions with this group of disciples, but this church made a profound difference in my life and in my wife's life, because in 1985, when we decided to begin the work of preaching the gospel with the Southside Church in Huntsville, Texas, this church not only helped us, they were like the help that made that happen. And so this has always been a very special group of disciples to me. I really, really appreciate that. And just honored that you guys let me come be part of this series this summer, even though this isn't when I was supposed to be here, right? I'm glad it worked out anyway. So let's put some apps on your spiritual phone tonight as we try to deal with suffering. First of all, I want to suggest, before you decide that God isn't good or that God has let us down, we need to probably take a look at our expectations. Now, the reason I say that is I think sometimes we process suffering poorly because we are expecting from God things that God never said he would do for us. I think sometimes disciples imagine that because we are serving Jesus, life ought to be good for us, right? I'd have a good job, pays me well, my transmission should not go out, and I shouldn't need a double lung transplant. I ought to be healthy and prosperous. And if anybody's going to suffer, it ought to be my neighbor who's heading out on Friday night and going to the lake, going to be gone all weekend, not even thinking about the Lord, who lives a corrupt life. That's the guy that ought to suffer, not me. And I know even as that comes out of my mouth, we're all saying, okay, yeah, I know it's not supposed to be that way. I just think we expect it to. And when it's not, it's disappointing. Listen, that's in the Bible. Go back and read Psalm 73. There's a great place to do some digging. Because the psalmist, Asaph, is frustrated about that too, that life just doesn't seem fair. But let me ask you, does the Bible lead us to believe that life is easier for people who follow God? Folks, that's just not what's in the Bible. Think of the good people we encounter in Scripture who had a hard time in life. And if this was like Bible class, we could just pause and start letting you guys throw out the answer, because I know you have some in your mind. Some of you are thinking of Job, right? First name maybe that came into your mind. Think about some of the abused prophets of the Old Testament, guys like Daniel who suffered. You get the New Testament. All of the apostles suffered. There's those disciples that got the book of Revelation who were dying for the cause. In 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 3, Paul would write to that afflicted church, and he would say, we are destined for afflictions. In fact, I would suggest it's implicit in the language of the psalmist. When he talks about God being our rock, does that not necessarily imply that there are times when we need something to hang on to because we're in a storm? Or he's our rescuer? Does that not imply there are times we will be in trouble and need a rescuer? Yes, the Bible does talk about a time when God's people will enjoy no mourning, no crying, no death, right? Where are we promised that? Yeah, it's in heaven. And that's our problem. I think sometimes we expect heaven on earth. And that isn't what he promised us. And so here, let me make this suggestion. If you have those moments where life isn't going quite like you anticipated, and you're frustrated with God, and you feel like maybe he wasn't doing for you what he thought he should do for you, or you thought he should do for you, maybe it's time to go back and think about, but what do I expect of him? And do my expectations align with what Scripture says they should be? Sometimes we need to go back and reconsider that. Now, I will tell you that I'm not completely satisfied with that answer, because part of me wants to say, but why can't it be better? Why can't life be better for people who are striving to serve God? Why In fact, his life seems so hard and unpleasant and troublesome sometimes. There's another thing I think we have to factor into this. Another place we need to dig around is into this matter of free will. I think sometimes the reason life on earth is difficult is because human beings exercise the free will that God gives them, and they use it to do terrible things, right? And sometimes other people's free will bumps into my life and causes me pain and suffering. I think it's been almost a decade ago. Some of you may remember this story. There was a depressed German co-pilot flying an airplane over in Germany. And the pilot on the flight, for some reason, had gotten up and left the cockpit for a moment, left the plane in control of the co-pilot, who locks the door behind him, which post 9/11 is now impenetrable. And he flies that plane into the ground. Y'all remember the story? And kills 153 people. Murders them. Can you imagine the suffering? The thousands of people who suffered because of his evil act? And so the atheist sees that, and the atheist says, why doesn't God do something about that? Why didn't God intervene and prevent that? And listen, a lot of times when the atheists say that, they know that's a really bad argument. But it does tug at the heartstrings, doesn't it? So let's just walk that path a little bit. Why didn't God do something about that? I think our question needs to be, what did you want God to do? Well, step in and keep him from doing that. Okay, so in that case, God should intervene and prevent this evil man from doing the evil he's determined to do, right? Just keep going that path. Does it only apply to plane crashes? There's lots of other evil stuff. I mean, did y'all watch the news before you came? Y'all could make me a list. I didn't watch the news. I was having dinner. Every day. Should God intervene and stop all of that stuff too? And maybe somebody would say, absolutely. Any evil thing men are determined to do, God ought to intervene and God ought to put a stop to that. Well, what about things that aren't evil? What about things that just may wind up hurting us unintentionally? Should God stop that too? Because whether it was intentional or unintentional, it still hurts. Do y'all see where this is going? Atheists are going to end up arguing that in order for God to be a God that I will love and serve, he must intervene and prevent me from doing anything that might potentially be harmful to me. And understand, folks, God can absolutely do that. It's just giving up free will for that to happen. Now I'm not making choices about serving God. I'm living out the program that he put in me. One of the consequences of free will, brothers and sisters, is that we live in a broken world where men use that free will to do terrible things. Is it not a bit naive to imagine that we will be unaffected by them? It's got to think about that. Someone says, oh, David, we need to say a lot more about free will. I know, but I'm watching the clock. We got more ground to cover. Remember, just apps on the phone tonight, that's all. And you're right, a lot more needs to be said about that. Now, did you wear your steel-toed loafers tonight? Because this next one's kind of dicey. This is the hard one, right? But we've got to put this on the list. The third thing that I think we need to consider is the possibility that I have a part in my suffering. That maybe I'm the cause of my suffering. In 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 17, there's this interesting encounter between the prophet Elijah and the wicked King Ahab. Y'all remember this story? There had been a long period of drought that Elijah had announced that God had sent. And when we get to 1 Kings 18, the drought is coming to an end, and God has sent Elijah to tell Ahab. And so when Ahab and Elijah meet up, in verse 17, y'all remember this? Ahab says to Elijah, "Is it you you troubler of Israel. Which is kind of funny, isn't it? Because Elijah will go in and point out, oh, wait, I'm not troubling Israel. Israel has trouble because you're a bad guy. And as the king, you're leading the people to do wicked things. You're leading people into idolatry. But oddly enough, Ahab is either unwilling or unable to see who's really causing the problems. Not Elijah, he's just telling him what God thinks about it. I will tell you that Ahab possessed a common human malady because we are really good at not owning our failures and taking responsibility for the grief through our foolish choices that we bring into our lives. I can always find a reason to blame somebody else, including God. So will you consider with me, is it really God's fault if I spend 3 or 4 or 5 decades of my life abusing my body with drugs or alcohol or cigarettes or food or whatever? And I get toward the back end of my journey and I begin to have suffering because I abused my body. Is that God's fault? Why am I blaming Him for my suffering? Or when I take God's financial resources that He's blessed us with, and if you're sitting in America tonight, you have been blessed generously with financial resources. And if I take those and I spend up every last dime that I have and whatever Visa's willing to throw into the mix and charge myself deep into the hole, and then, as Proverb warns again, the day of trouble comes and I have nothing, and immediately there's a catastrophe like, we're not going to eat at the end of the month because I lost my job. Is it fair to blame God for that? How is that God's fault when I was foolish in the managing of those resources? And listen, we could just go through all Proverbs tonight. There's a place to dig. Proverbs says all kinds of things about being wise with the possessions we have been given. And sometimes, folks, the reason we're hurting is because we have been dumb. We haven't listened to Him. Now, let me tell you why I think that's so very important. Sometimes we hold the key to dealing with our own suffering. Rather than me being mad at God, all I need to do is to listen to Him and be wise. And I can deal with the suffering that's in my life. As long as I'm busy finding people to blame, guess what? At the end of the day, it's still going to hurt. So I think we need to consider that. Do I have a part in my suffering? Number 4. Let's throw this one in too. As we ponder our seasons of suffering, I think sometimes we also need to give some thought to God's timetable. Y'all sing the hymn, In His Time? Y'all know that? Would y'all sing it here? We don't sing it as much as we used to, I think, when it was kind of a newer hymn. I guess it's not its time anymore. But man, I really loved that hymn when we first began to sing it. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I love that hymn because I just hadn't thought very deeply about it. And as I began to think more about suffering, I also began to think more about that hymn. And liked it less the more I thought about it. He makes all things beautiful right when I want Him to do it. That would be a better version of that song, wouldn't it? We want it to be. He makes all things beautiful in His time, right? It's actually capturing a biblical idea. You encounter it in the Psalms sometimes, like in Psalm 27, verses 13 and 14, where that language, wait on the Lord, is used. You're familiar with that biblical language? You encounter that sometimes in Scripture, the need to wait on the Lord. It's a truth. Surely you've heard someone describe about prayer before. Surely you've heard some preacher say, when God answers prayer, sometimes He says yes, sometimes He says no. And sometimes he says, you heard it, what is it? Wait. Yeah. And listen, that's all okay when we're singing it in a hymn and not really paying attention to what the hymn is saying. But when it's reality and I'm waiting for God to heal my mom, or I'm waiting, as a brother I know who's been waiting more than a year now to find a job, all of a sudden that isn't so pretty anymore, is it? Suddenly that's really hard to look to God and say, in your time, I'll wait for you. I think really what is underneath all of that is the issue of trust. Proverbs 3 and verse 5, the wise man said, to trust in the Lord with all your heart, and he adds, do not lean in your own understanding, right? All your ways acknowledge him. He will make your path straight. That's really what this is about. It's about trusting God. So I will tell you how I feel about the song In His Time. I think it's a perfectly scriptural idea. I just think it's hard. Sometimes not very pretty. It's hard in the middle of suffering to wait on the Lord, to work it out in His time. Can I give you some consolation about that? I want you to think back to Genesis 37 and Joseph's story. You know that story. You know that Joseph was the prized child in Jacob's family until the brothers sold him off, right? And after that, he becomes a slave in Egypt. And then even in Egypt, he ultimately ends up in an Egyptian dungeon. Question: how long did that ugly season last in Joseph's life? Have you ever thought about it? Scripture actually answers that question, because in Genesis 37 and verse 2, we're actually told he was a teenager, 17 years old, when he was pasturing his father's flock right at the beginning of everything going wrong in his life. And in Genesis 41 and verse 46, we're told that he was 30 when he was called to come interpret Pharaoh's dream, and that's the next pivot point where everything in his life turns right again. So do the math. How long? 13 years-ish, one way or the other. 13 years. Let me ask you, do you guys think that Joseph, from the very first night he was sold into slavery, do you think he prayed for God to deliver him? I mean, I admit, we don't know. But I would think he did. I would, if I was in his shoes. Let me ask you, would you pray about it occasionally? If I was enslaved by somebody and being hauled off to some spot that I did not know about without a cell phone, I would be praying all the time, every day. And then sold as a slave, all the time, every day. And then the Egyptian dungeon, I would be ratcheting up the frequency of my prayers. I really need you to deliver me. 13 years. No answer. So I mentioned that just for perspective. When you pray on Monday and by Friday, Monday's problems aren't fixed. Maybe I need to learn to wait better. Or even if they're not fixed next month or next year or ever, do I trust God to work this out? Which brings us to a second thing that needs to be added to this. We need to ponder God's timetable, and we need to ponder God's agenda too. In his excellent book, Disappointment with God, Philip Yancey made an intriguing observation about the book of Job. I've thought a lot about this. Yancey says that the most important chapters in Job are not all the chapters in the middle where his friends argue with him about what's going on, right? Those are valuable, but he said they aren't the most valuable. But the odd thing is that Yancey says the most important chapters in Job are not the ones at the end where God speaks, even though those are very, very important. Yancey contends that the most important chapters in Job are actually the two chapters we know the best. the first two. And he argues that they're the most important because it's there we discover that there's more to this story. That God's doing stuff behind the scenes, which is what makes Job and his friends arguing with each other so utterly pointless. They don't have any idea what got going on, but he does have something going on. I would continue to see exactly the same thing in Joseph's life. In Genesis 39, Scripture does something odd that it does not typically do. Twice in Genesis 39, we're given Joseph's resume, and we're given his resume in some detail, which is kind of odd. Why didn't Scripture just say he was bought by Potiphar and became the number one slave in the house? That would have told the story, right? But we're not told that. We're told over 6 verses how God worked to advance Joseph, right? And then you get to the end of Genesis 39, and he's thrown into prison, and God does the same thing again. He doesn't say Joseph got thrown into prison and he became the number one guy in the prison. That would tell us the info we needed. But God walks through step by step. As he started out as just another prisoner in the prison, and he grows to be the number one guy there. Have you ever wondered why we're given that detail? It actually fills in a plot hole in the story that I don't even think we think about. This 17-year-old kid sold into slavery comes out of the slavery 13 years later and is put in charge of Egypt and leads Egypt well. How did he learn to do that? Working up the food chain as a slave in Potiphar's house, and then working up the food chain in the prison and becoming a leader. And he learned from Potiphar's house and from the prison how to lead. You see, for 13 years, God didn't ignore Joseph's prayers. He just worked on a different agenda. And so it's made me wonder if sometimes during my seasons of suffering, I need to think about that. Could it be that when you and I are suffering, that God is letting us pass through that season because he's working on something bigger? Maybe he's letting me suffer to bless me. Ooh, that's an awful thought, isn't it? But every one of you in this crowd, we all know that this is true. I have learned a few lessons from my victories. But the most compelling, memorable, useful lessons in my life have always been the lessons I learned when I was in the trenches of adversity. How about you? Yeah, when you failed that test, it made all the difference about how you were going to handle your academic work in the future, right? When you were about to lose your house, it changed everything about the way you managed your finances down the road. Or maybe God's going to use my suffering to bless somebody else. That's what he was doing with Joseph. Joseph was being positioned to deliver the family of the Messiah. He's playing this key role. God had bigger things in mind for him. I've had to consider that about some of my friends who've died. Last year at this time, I was watching my friend Matt Bassford die. That was not fair. How many of you read the things that he wrote the last 2 years of his life? Which brethren will read for generations. Maybe God was using him to change brethren about death for generations, to bless all of them. 4 minutes. I told you all, it's extraordinarily unlikely that I'm going to get this done. But I want to throw this last one up, and we'll do with it what we can. I think sometimes we don't process our suffering well because we don't take in a big enough picture. We see our suffering too narrowly. Let me illustrate that. Sometimes people feel like God has let them down because, for example, they're suffering financially. They just haven't prospered like others had. Their jobs never paid what they wanted it to, or they never were as successful as they wanted it to be. If that's you, if you've been frustrated because financially life hasn't been what you wanted it to be, I want you to do this. I want you to get out a sheet of paper and write down all of the gripes about that in column A. Could you do that? And when you get column A all filled out about how God let you down at that, in column B, just start in Ephesians 1 and 3 and list all of the riches you have in Jesus Christ. And I promise you, when you get done with column B, column A will look different. Or maybe it's more serious. Maybe you've got illness, maybe serious illness. Maybe you're not sure if you're going to survive the illness and you're frustrated. You've prayed for healing and that hasn't happened. Put healing in column A. God hasn't healed my disease. But in column B, you've got to write down the disease he did heal. Through the blood of his son, he delivered me from my sin. I wonder if column B will make us feel differently about column A. What do you think? Isn't it interesting that in passages like Philippians 4 in verse 8 and Colossians 4 in verse 2, we're urged by Paul to pray with thanksgiving? Have you ever pondered the value of that? That it's more than just God deserves a thank you. I have tried to get in the habit before I ask God for anything to do what the old song says, count my many blessings, name them one by one. I got to tell you, the more careful I am to do that, the more awkward I feel asking God for anything. If all he did was rescue me from my sins, it would be enough, wouldn't it, to be eternally grateful. Every one of us sitting here, so much more. I've had to think about that with my friend Pat. Pat was 54 years old when he died. If he had been 74, I still would have been sad. But I wouldn't have been disappointed with God. So epiphany number one was I'm quibbling with God over 20 years, 2 decades. That's column A. Column B is eternity. You know what the clincher was? Found myself quibbling with God over 2 decades that Pat doesn't want. And then I really felt foolish. Because candidly, brothers and sisters, sometimes this does just make us look a little childish. We're like a 5-year-old at a birthday party with a table piled high with all these presents and cake and ice cream and all these things. And the 5-year-old's throwing a tantrum because mom brought his cake on a blue plate instead of a red one. If all he did was save me, would be enough. Paul said, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to be revealed to us. And again to the Corinthians, so we do not give up. Our physical bodies become older and weaker, but our spirit inside us is made new every day. We have small troubles for a while now, but they are helping us gain an eternal glory much greater than the trouble. It is childish to quibble with God over a few things that I feel like he hasn't done for me, forgetting all that he has. Yet, worse yet, putting at risk all that he will do. I think sometimes in our seasons of suffering, we need to step back. We've got to look at this with a bigger view of the picture. I show that I'm 1 minute past. Do I need to stop? I expected little kids to start coming in at any moment now. Okay, here's the last word. I'm seeing a 1 minute sign. So I think I got just enough time to say this to you. All we did tonight was install the apps. Your season's going to come. And when you do, these are some places where we need to dig. Brothers and sisters, the issue of suffering is far too complicated to try to oversimplify with just a couple of carefully crafted slogans. We got to do some work here. We got to do some study and think deeply. I will just close with this last comment. But when it comes to the love of God, that issue was settled forever at Calvary. I do not care what life throws your way or mine during the rest of the journey that you and I have. At the end of the day, the love of God is never in question. Forever, there's a cross near Jerusalem that settled that issue forever. I'm so glad I was invited to be with you tonight, and I'm thankful for your good attention.